enough extra credit. I mean,
You give people choices.
Welcome again, ladies and gentlemen, again to the January 2021 meeting of the Tallahassee Historical Society meeting. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Andrew Frank, who is the Alan Morris Professor of History at Florida State University. Before I introduce Andrew, let me sort of give this housekeeping thing. Once you entered this webinar, you were muted for feedback control. During this webinar, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen may be used to submit any questions for Dr. Frank to be answered at the end of his presentation, time permitting. Should you experience any technical issues, please contact us through the chat feature. Assisting well, let me give a thank you out to our webmaster, Brendan Krillin, who has set all of this up for us this year, but also helping us tonight, particularly with monitoring any questions, will be Mary Ellen Clark. So having said that, let me say a few words about Andrew. First, the boilerplate, if that's the right word. He is an ethno-historian who specializes in the history of the Seminoles and the Native South. He is currently writing a book-length manuscript on the history of the Florida Seminoles, tentatively entitled "Those Who Camp at a Distance, the Seminoles and Indians of Florida." I don't know whether that's still the title or not, but that's what it has on your website. He is the author of "Before the Pioneers, Indians, Settlers, Slaves, and the Founding of Miami," which explores 2,000 years of continuous occupation on the north bank of the Miami River. He is also the author of Creeks and Southerners, Biculturalism on the Early American Frontier, and here it is right here. His other books include the Rutledge Historical Atlas of the American South and Borderland Narratives Exploring North America's Contested Spaces. And I know I'm leaving some stuff out. I first met Andrew 14 years ago, shortly after he came to FSU and shortly after I started to teach at TCC. We had lunch together because I was thinking of returning to school for my PhD. Since all the members of my committee for my master's had fled the state in horror at the prospect, I thought I might build a new committee, starting with him. The more I talked that day, the more I noticed that he began looking at me very oddly and scooting his chair further and further away from mine, something that's a common occurrence with me. To his great relief, I think, I never did return to school, and we have remained friends since. He has just become a member of the Historical Society's Bicentennial Committee, so it's nice to know that I didn't traumatize him too much that day 14 years ago. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Andrew Frank.
Well, thank you for that. You did not shake me in horror. I think at the moment I was living in horror of, I have to sit on committees. How does this work? So I was not so much a personal thing as my own kind of adjustment to being in Tallahassee and at a really big school. All right, so I'm kind of flattered by the introduction. And what I'm going to try to do today is what I normally do when I talk about my work. And I'm really interested in kind of the history of the Seminole tribe of Florida, But as a scholar, I'm really also interested in what it is that we know and why is it that we know it. I mean, as a scholar, we always spend our times trying to adjust or reimagine the past, not just to know what other people know and memorize it, obviously, but to figure out what's new. And when I started writing this project on the Seminoles, I thought I read everything that there had been written on the Seminoles, which wasn't as much as I had hoped. I thought I'd write a synthesis, and I had written a whole bunch of stuff on the Creek Indians in Florida, and everyone told me through writing and in person that the Seminoles were Creeks. And then I started writing, and nothing made sense. And I started talking to tribal members, and it made less sense. And I started doing more research, and I realized I had to scrap everything that I had done because I was given bad information. And so what I want to do today is get away from this idea of understanding the Seminole tribe of Florida as being renegades. Like, I mean, it's so impressed upon our meaning of what Seminoles are, is that, of course, renegade is one of the symbols at FSU, or Runaways, right? This idea that Seminole is the translation of Cimarron, or like kind of the Ellis Island version of when Spaniards say runaway cow or runaway animal, they say Cimarron. Somehow that becomes Seminole because they're runaways. All this I'm hoping to kind of explain to you why that's kind of really misleading. The book that I'm writing tentatively is called Those Who Camp at a Distance, because that's the way that Seminoles, both in Oklahoma and in Florida, kind of translated the term Seminole before they were told that it meant runaway or wild or renegade. All right, so let me share my screen with you. I have some pictures and some quotations, kind of a PowerPoint. You don't need to see me anymore. And we will go from there. But I appreciate everyone being here. And hold on one sec. All right, there we go. All right. Here are the kind of the main points that I hope that I'm going to make today. First and foremost, Seminoles have always claimed that they've had ancestors in and ties to ancient Florida, right? Most scholars out there, in fact, 90% of them, or if you were to go to the library and pick up a book, they will tell you that the Seminoles once upon a time were Creeks. They broke off kind of like a colony, and then they planted roots in Florida sometime in the 17 or early 1800s. And then the Seminoles slowly formed and became a new people. Now, there are migrants who come into Florida and become Seminoles, but Seminoles themselves say that they have always been here, and they have always said that they have always been here. The second thing that I'm going to explain a little bit of is that the term Seminole was a term applied by outsiders as part of a colonial process, not who are you? We are Seminole. Oh, we'll call you Seminole then, but rather outsiders see indigenous people in Florida and they call them Seminole for very particular purposes, and they call them wild or renegade or runaways for a purpose. And the third thing, which is probably the most important part, is that the historical evidence supports the idea that the Seminoles have been here for a long time. But the source space itself is a colonial source space. And we can see why that source space has led us astray. And I hope we'll get a sense of why it went so funky. All right, so here we have it. The term Seminole was a term applied by outsiders long before the Indians of Florida used it. Indeed, in the early 20th century, unless it was at a tourist venture, Indians in Florida tended not to use the term. They would refer to them as Cow Creeks if they were at the Brighton Reservation. They would refer to themselves as Miccosukes. They would refer to themselves as Big Cypress. They would refer to themselves as Tallahasseans when they were from the village of Tallahassee or Alachua. Depending on what time period you were, they always referred to themselves by their village rather than a collective sense of identity. But the Spanish, when they were here, called them Cimarron for runaway animal. The Seminoles sometimes were called by Creeks in Georgia and Alabama Seminole, which means separatist, or they came to interpret as separatist, right? In the 1700s, at about the same time that the United States is forming as a new nation, the Creeks in Georgia, and a little bit in Alabama, and a little bit in North Florida, they too start to form a centralized nation state, or they try to. And some of the Indians in Florida, these indigenous folks, these folks who later become Seminole, want nothing to do with this new nation. So they get called separatists, even though they're not really separate. They're not separating. They just aren't part of the Creeks. And then eventually the Seminoles become Seminoles by English speakers, both by Great Britain and then the United States. But Native people have always claimed that they were indigenous. They have always claimed that they are indeed always been here. So here's Chief Micanopy of the town Micanopy is named for, right south of Gainesville in Alachua County. Chief Micanopy says to John Quincy Adams, here, basically the heart of Florida, our navel strings were first cut and blood from them sunk into the earth and made the country dear to us. We were born here. This is our land. Right? All people have a right to choose where they are from. And Micanopy says, in a time before memory, in a time but older than dirt, this is where we were born. But he's not the only one. Here's Halleck Tustenugee, another Seminole warrior. I will talk to you like a brother, he says to a colonel. I will tell you the truth. From my heart, I will tell you, I have held out a long time for my country. I have fought hard for it. I had always lived here, Florida. And when a boy traveled over the country with my bow and arrow, here my father was buried. And I thought I might as well die here as go to another country and die. So as fighting the Third Seminole War, about to go into the Third Seminole War, here's Halleck Tustenugee, a warrior, saying, this is where my father was born, and this is where he died, and this is where I was born. This is my homeland. Right, so we have Micanopy, Tustenugee, Calusahatchee, Wildcat. My father, King Philip, told me I was made of the sands of Florida, and then when I was placed in the ground, the Seminoles would dance and sing around my grave. The old Indians have told me that the white man first came from the foam of the ocean thrown up upon the beach. After laying for a time subjected to the heat of the sun, they assumed a human form and walked forth into the interior of the country. The first white man, my father told me, that was seen in Florida was a Spaniard. His tracks were found on the shore of Lake Okeechobee. So oral testimony, oral memory passed down from Calusahatchee's whatever grandparent or uncle or aunt, passed on ultimately to King Philip and ultimately to him, was that the Spanish were in Lake Okeechobee. And I want you to hold on to this idea that it's Lake Okeechobee. But there are others. In another place, Wildcat said that the Seminoles descend from giants 6 to 8 feet tall who had always been here. An ethnomusicologist in the early to mid 20th century recorded the Calusa corn dance, which the Seminoles that he was learning from, they told him that they learned it from the mountain men. One interpretation could be the mound men. The Calusas lived on mounds in what is now Naples along the Gulf Coast. Buffalo Tiger records the words that the Miccosukee speakers used to describe the people that live in the past. Bobby Billy said, we don't come from the creek. The Seminole people come from the earth, right? The origin story of the Seminole tribe of Florida, the one that most often gets told, says that they were once upon a time living in a shell and the wind was blowing and then the shell cracked open and the shell was on top of a mound or a mountain, and they've come out in the order of their clan, that they were born here in Florida. Sorry, I just got muted for a second, so let's go back. All right. So the question is, why have we been taught that they are migrants, runaways, and renegades? And before I move on, I want to tell you a quick story that I had an advisor once tell me. And he was a pretty absent-minded advisor. And he said something like, oh dear, I lost my keys last night on my way from my office to my car. And it was dark. So I went to every light post along the way and my keys were nowhere to be found. And the class just looked at him like he was crazy because, like, of course, you don't just look where the light's shining. You have to look everywhere between the office and the car. And when we told him that he was just being stupid about this, he said, aha, you don't just look where the evidence is easiest and most apparent. You have to look for evidence, not just most apparent evidence. And indeed, the most apparent evidence always tells us that Florida was emptied. We have lots of sources by military folks and diplomatic folks and missionaries about the epidemics, the evacuations, and the slave raids that really did depopulate Florida in ways that we are yet to really come to grips with. We believe there was something along the lines of 1/3 350,000 or so Native Americans in Florida when the Europeans first arrived. And when Spain evacuates Florida and Great Britain takes over and the United States ultimately takes over around 1800-ish, we're talking about a few thousand. So there really is a huge depopulation, but depopulation is not the same thing as being empty. So I'm going to use one person, one source, this guy Thomas Nairn, an Englishman in the early 1700s, to talk about how we get to a point where we can believe that Florida is empty. Nairn writes a really remarkable set of letters and has a journal. And in it, there's a quotation that lots and lots of scholars of early America quote, because he comes with the Yamasee Indians. He's a British guy, and he comes into Florida on a slave raid multiple times. And they go into Appalachee country, they come into Timucua country, and ultimately they come down into the heart of basically Lake Okeechobee area. And they're looking for indigenous slaves, they're capturing them, and they're bringing them back up to Carolina, where they get transported mostly into the Caribbean to be on free labor. And this is what he writes. Our forces, our Yamasee and British forces, entirely broke and ruined the strength of the Spaniards in Florida, destroyed the whole country, burnt the towns, brought all the Indians who were not killed or made slaves into our territories, so that there remains not now so much as one village with 10 houses in it in all of Florida. You read that, and he is bragging that we have, as Great Britain, gotten all the Indians out. There is nothing left. And indeed, after he writes this, these slave raids into Florida, for the most part, come to an end. There are a handful of raids down to Key West, but in the heart of Florida, from say Miami to Naples and north, almost no raids into the area, none of significance. And he draws this amazing map. Or a map gets made, and you can kind of look at the dead center. You can see good ground, Florida, but look where Lake Okeechobee is. Well, I'll give you a close up in a second. Right, he takes the St. Johns River from what is now Jacksonville, goes all the way down the river, which is really going upstream because the river kind of flows the other direction. He gets to the point where he says that you can't go by canoe anymore because it's alternating dry and wetlands. They leave their canoes. And if you look around the lake, you can see all these letters. And he puts his description, explanation of an expedition to Florida by 33 Yamasee Indians accompanied by Thomas Nairn. A is the place where the Indians leave their canoes to go slave hunting. It is 6 days rowing from St. John's River's mouth. Then there's large Indian lakes, right? We can imagine Florida has always been described as lakes and islands, in large part because it's alternating water and land. And if you read and keep going, this is the place where they took 29 slaves. Here they took 6 slaves. Here they took and killed 33 men at 2 o'clock on the same day, ... The last sentence, they having no arms but harpoons made of iron and fish bones. They were all painted, and then they returned home. So we read the story, the quotation, we see the map. He sees them going into the heart of the Everglades. We can look at that map and know that that is precisely where the Big Cypress Reservation and the Brighton Reservation today are, the two largest historic reservations of the Seminole tribe of Florida. And it seems empty, gone. Now, I had to blow this up all the way, but you can see it's blurry, and I apologize, GHILMN, but if you follow the arrow, that says many villages or manyville. He never goes down there. He knows that there are many villages down there. But if you've ever spent any time south of Lake Okeechobee, or if you can imagine what that world was like before the dredging and the dikes and the water management that the Army Corps of Engineers has done, it was impossible for him to get from the tour that he took of Lake Okeechobee south. He knew that there were Indians there. He put it on the map. But when he went home, his job was done. For his purpose, Florida was empty. And because it's so eminently quotable, scholars have agreed it is empty. And indeed, when the Spanish evacuate Florida for the first time in 1763, they evacuate the Indians who had been churched or converted from their missions. So the Indians in various missions across the colony were literally plucked from their homes, from the missions, and brought to primarily to Havana. And they did evacuate everyone from their missions. But not everyone in the missions, or excuse me, not all native people in Florida were in the missions. Just like the English slave raiders saw Florida as not cost efficient, it was too difficult to reach too few. The missionaries said, we got all the Indians out. And what that meant is they got all the Indians under their control out. When the slave raiders said Florida was empty, they said there are no more slaves to be had, not that there were no native people left. For Spanish missionaries and English enslavers, the two largest, most prolific writers of the era, Florida was, for lack of a better word, empty enough. From the indigenous point of view, they were still here. So the small villages of the interior and the South are ignored. The northern panhandle Florida was all that mattered in later years for slave catchers looking for runaway African Americans, for British and US diplomats looking for allies, for Creek nationalists looking for people who they thought should be part of their new Creek nation. Folks in the interior of Florida simply don't exist. If you pick up the East Florida papers, the territorial papers, the Papeles de Cuba, the colonial office records, the American state papers, any of the largest collections of documents from the era, they cared deeply about everything from St. Augustine all the way across to Pensacola, and they called that Florida. And everything south of Gainesville or Alachua was no man's land, was empty, was what one governor called God-forsaken country. There have been a whole bunch of biographies about this one ne'er-do-well, William Augustus Bowles, a British military guy during the American Revolution. He marries a Creek woman. He has a price on his head. The Spanish don't like him. The British don't like him. The Americans don't like him because he keeps raiding people over and over and over, and he disappears. But he disappeared to what's now Miami. But no one knew where he was, and no one was even aware that they could look for him, what is now kind of the largest place in Florida, but at the time was God-forsaken country. So the colonists, whether they be colonists or settlers, they needed to see the people as runaways, and that shapes our source base. Indeed, the most pressing concern for most of this history was the fact that Florida was indeed the home or the destination for runaway African Americans, for those folks in the American South who were able to find a means to get kind of out of eyesight of their owner. Florida was closer and easier to get to than, say, Canada, right? If you can imagine being in southern Georgia, like we live in Tallahassee, like my house is like 15, 20 miles from the Georgia border. If I'm 20 miles north of here, I can imagine finding my way walking to Alachua. I can't imagine my way getting through Georgia, the Carolinas, all the way up like to freedom. Simply can't happen. And so slave catchers keep coming into Florida, and diplomats keep coming into Florida, and they blur that line between the enslaved, and then they call them Black Seminoles, even though they're really not Black Seminoles, right? They're more Maroons living in independent communities, and they blur the lines between them and indigenous folks who are here. Then they blur the line because it's really important for the US military to say that the Seminoles don't have a right to here. James Gadsden, Gadsden County, the Aborigines of the country of Florida have long since been exterminated, he writes. The Seminoles came and occupied the most desirable part of Florida and claimed it through conquest. They were only to be treated with the same principles. The Seminoles basically are saying they're newcomers too. They conquered the people who were here first, and so we have every right to conquer them. They don't have rights to the land. It's a really convenient truth. The Creek nationalists in Georgia, they do the same thing. They say that the newcomers in Florida, they're under their control. And as they're trying to build a nation and kind of puff their chest up to the United States to say how big and powerful and strong they are, by claiming the folks in Florida, they seem to be even bigger. And all these sources ultimately shape the scholarship that we read. Now, I normally don't put pictures of secondary sources, but William Sturtevant was the single most important anthropologist / historian of the Seminole tribe that exists. He invents this idea of ethnogenesis, this idea of an indigenous group can have an origin, and he uses the Seminole as proof. And he writes this piece called Creek into Seminole, and it is the piece of historical literature that everyone either cites or they cite the people that cite him. But if you look closely, and we're going to do a really close read and follow the trail a little bit, at the very start, he says the Indians occupying this region, Florida, like most peoples everywhere, trace their own history back to the original creation in quite a direct line. In a discussion of Seminole history, it might make sense to borrow from this Seminole point of view and begin ... So he knows he spent years of his life doing his doctoral research and then later talking with and living amongst the Miccosukee speakers. And they told him that they went back to ancient times. But he says this chapter will follow the preceding route to the extent of ignoring these Creek and Seminoles. We will not begin with prehistory, but with an exploration of Seminole origins as colonies that gradually became distinct and independent. He starts by saying, Seminoles, my informants have told me one thing, but I, as the expert, know better. And since then, everyone has agreed. Brent Weissman, a phenomenal historical archaeologist, refers to the ancestral Creek of the Seminoles. John Swanton called them the late offshoot of the Creeks. Harry Kersey, a mentor of mine, refers to their Creek origins and migration. And it's true, some Creeks did come to Florida, but each one of them ignores the ancient presence or the presence of ancient Floridians in Seminole society. The power of this received wisdom is amazing. So here's Jane Reno doing an interview. It's at the University of Florida, Sam Proctor, and she says, I was told not long ago, she spent a lot of time doing work with the Miccosukee, and she said, I was told not too long ago, I guess it was Howard Osceola who told me, he said, Jane, you know there are still some Spanish Indians in the Everglades. And the term Spanish Indians is the term that scholars and others have used to describe the descendants of the Calusas or the Tequestas or any of the large indigenous groups that were here when the Spanish arrived. And Jane says, and I said, really? You know, the Spanish Indians we read in history were called the Calusas. I said, really? And he said, there are some out there. This is Howard Osceola. There are some out there, they say. I've never seen one, but my mother and daddy did. And there's supposed to be some living out there on the hammocks. Now, from my point of view, this is a gold mine. Howard Osceola, out of the blue, is saying that the Spanish Indians are still there. Later, he says they speak a language that is not intelligible to either Miccosukee speakers or Seminole speakers, but they're distinctive. The interviewer responds and cuts her off. I've heard that term Spanish Indians before, and nearest we can tell, let me remind you, if there ever were such a thing, then they've all died out. But that's an interesting story, and then she moves on. Rather than asking a follow-up question so we can get information, the informant says that there were some people in Florida that have always been here that are part of this indigenous community. The interviewer says, nope, that's not true. Let's go on to something that's more important. William Sturtevant can't escape the received wisdom he actually creates. He writes there were several different Indian groups in Southwest Florida in the first part of the 19th century, probably a Calusa settlement, the town of Caloosahatchee, and Calusa remnants elsewhere. So as much as the Seminoles say we trace our ancestry back, as much as he sees Seminole or indigenous communities in the 19th century, probably a Calusa settlement, he's insistent that they are all newcomers. So this now decides whether we're going to look at the light post for the keys, or are we going to walk slowly from the classroom to the car and check even in the darkness to see if there's evidence there? Are we going to go with the preponderance of paper, or are we actually going to weigh the evidence? Are we going to use traditional evidence, traditional in the sense of what historians are most comfortable with? We like 3 quotations equals a fact, or we can do something a little bit more interdisciplinary that seems maybe even more guesswork. So here's a site. This is the north bank of the Miami River, which I wrote my last book on. And it's 1 square block, and we can find 2,000 years of continuous occupation there. It started as a Tequesta settlement. We see this in both the archaeological record, but also in the written records once everyone from Ponce de Leon onward kind of comes to the shores there. It later becomes known as a Costa settlement. It later becomes a settlement of Seminoles. And then later it becomes Henry Flagler's Hotel. But we can see, like, it's not that the Tequestas leave and the Costas take over. The Tequestas get ravaged by slave raids, and refugees take home with the survivors of the Tequesta. And ultimately, this group then welcomes more people that later call themselves Seminoles. If we go into the center of the state to an archaeological site called Fort Center, or which is now kind of like Greater Lake Okeechobee, if you use such a phrase, there too, we have 2,000 years of really continuous occupation. The names of the people may change, but the kinship ties don't. Someone's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother has their kin still there. Other ways of looking at it, there's a food that Seminoles eat in the 1800s, and they're eating it especially during the Second Seminole War and afterwards, is a tubular root of Coontie. There's actually Coontie growing at FSU. It's native to Florida. It's mostly a coastal plant, but you can plant it all sorts of places. But it doesn't grow in Georgia, where the creeks are from, let alone Alabama or the Carolinas. The Tequesta ate it in Miami. The Calusa ate it in what is now Naples. But it's poisonous. You have to grind it, and then you have to like run water on it and strain it and strain it and rinse it and strain it and rinse it and strain it multiple times. Otherwise, it's poisonous. And after you get all the toxins out, it's an edible starch. Well, the Seminoles who were described as chased into the interior of Florida are eating it immediately. So either they were chased and they met people there who taught them, or they had been in that area for a long time and knew what they were looking for. Again, we don't know the first person who made Coontie. We know that the Tequesta have been using it forever. We don't know the first so-called Seminole to do so, but there was no moment of pause. It was something that was eaten right away. If we go to linguistics, the term Calusa is everywhere in Florida. The Calusa were supposed to be gone, but the Caloosahatchee River, Calusa and Hatchee simply means river, it's a Muskogee term. To the best of our knowledge, the Calusas did not speak Muskogee Creek. William Bartram writes, an old Creek or Seminole town in North Florida told him that there was a little town near Charlotte Harbor called Caloosahatchee, and this nation they called Calusa-Olgies. Olgi is the Muskogee tongue signifying people or nation. So the Calusa Nation was there, according to a creek in North Florida that Bartram may have called the Seminole at times. That's in 1774. Bernard Romans the following year writes, the last retreats and skulking places of the Calusa savages, when their more potent neighbors, the Creeks, drove them off the continent. So he sees them both at the same place, but the Creeks must have conquered them. Caloosahatchee, spelled in a really funky way, is on the United States' official list of Seminole towns in 1799. So somehow Caloosahatchee is there in multiple ways, but someone had to tell them that it was the Calusa, and some people say they actually were Calusa. When the United States in 1823 signs its first treaty with the Indians in Florida, they don't even use the term Seminoles to describe them. They refer to them as the Florida Indians, plural, or the Florida Indian tribes, plural. And they do that in the treaty, they do it during the war, and they do that in removal. Even in the lists of names of people that were forced off their lands and put on boats or in chains and taken to Indian country territory in Oklahoma, or what is Oklahoma now, they differentiate between the various ways that the Seminoles define themselves, normally through village and sometimes Calusa. The Florida Indians used a Calusa style of thatching of the roofs in their chickees by the 1880s. They're not using round houses, they're using square houses like Creeks would have, but the thatching, the peculiar way that the Calusas did thatching, we think the Seminoles do the same thing. The Miccosukee speakers to the south in Florida outnumber the Seminole speakers in Florida, but not in Oklahoma, where Seminole speakers completely outnumber them, which makes me kind of, my hunch is that the Miccosukee speakers in the south in Florida were here a lot longer and were much less willing or much more willing to fight to the end than people who are newcomers to Florida, who are being told to move to a place from a relatively, say, if you were brand new to Florida and you came in 1820 and you're being told you need to go to Indian territory to survive, and it's 1835, maybe that's a possibility. But if your ancestors, the blood of your navel was here 500 years ago or 300 years ago, it's much, much harder to imagine. We also have one description after another of Florida Indians knowing their way in the Everglades as they're fleeing during the Seminole War. They weren't newcomers. The Florida Indians used different dugout canoes than the Creeks do. The technology that they use to create them are different. They even use sails really, really early from Florida in a way that they did not in Creek society. I say all this to basically say that our goal here is to revisit old sources with new assumptions and to imagine that Seminoles are indigenous, not just newcomers. That if we can think back of that map that we had at the very beginning of Thomas Nairn, that he indeed, elsewhere he refers to knifing all the Indians in Florida, that they're all gone, and yet there are many villages. That rather than looking at the easy quotation that he has, that if we look at the actual map, and he says that afterwards there are many villages, maybe then we can get a better sense of what indigenous Floridians actually are. So that's what I have for you. It is a lifetime of work that I'm still kind of piecing together. Every time I do it, I use little different types of evidence and ways of going about it. But I'm hoping that there are questions. But at the very least, I hope that we are skeptical. Because I'll give one last thing. I hope we are skeptical of anyone who says that the Seminoles are runaways. Because in my brief understanding of how names work, no one ever calls themselves a runaway. People call themselves brave, courageous. They might be wild. Renegade may be something better, but no one calls themselves a runaway. Which is why the book that I'm writing is called Those Who Camp at a Distance, right? People who are free rather than fleeing. All right, that's what I have for you. I hope there are questions. Otherwise,
yes,
Bob,
there are. So, Professor, can you see the question in the Q&A?
I do. I'm pulling it up right now.
Great.
Yep. So in case anyone can't see it, I'll read it out loud. A number of African Americans in Leon County point to ancestors from the 1890s and early 1900s who self-identified as Indian. Maggie Yellowhair is the one I see mentioned sometimes. What is known about the population here at that time? That is a great question. So I'm going to answer it in two different ways because I don't have great information about Maggie Yellowhair. I wish I could give you kind of the definitive story, but I know probably less than you do. I know the name and I've heard stories, but I can't talk to the veracity of any of the stories. But this I can tell you. There are dozens of free Black communities in Florida from as early as basically the 1680s up through the Seminole Wars and into the 20th century. Some are well known, some are not well known. As Jim Crow becomes the violent, repressive, public way of law after the American Civil War, the presence of free Black towns became, and as Florida became more settled, the presence of these towns threatened kind of the status quo. We see Rosewood get destroyed, razed to the ground in the early 20th century. There are other areas during election times, I'm blanking on it, which town it was that during elections that the African-American community was basically lynched. One of the ways in which African-American communities dealt with that is they declared themselves to be Native as a means of getting out of that. And we believe that there are some African-Americans who are in Major League Baseball in the same fashion that they call themselves Native American, that they were Hawaiian rather than African-American. The flip is, there are also lots of African Americans who had family members who were Native American. They weren't necessarily members of the Seminole tribe or Creek tribe, but if you have a parent who is Native American, you can call yourself Native American, and they're mixed. But they are neither members of the community down in South Florida who are the Seminole tribe, or in Oklahoma who are the Seminole Nation or the Creeks. And they don't quite have a place when we connect race and nation in the United States. And my hunch is it's probably the latter that get us there. All right, next question. I hope I did justice to that one. Benjamin Gunter does ask, excuse me, do the dances of the Seminoles provide evidence of indigeneity? Yes. So we know the Seminoles are Native. What is most interesting to me about the dances of the Seminoles of Florida is that the ways in which Seminoles in Florida dance are similar but not the same, at least as recorded and understood, as Seminoles in Indian Territory. I don't know if it gives us, I don't think I need to use that to prove that they're indigenous, but I think we can use it as a way of understanding that Seminole culture is living. And as a lived culture, it's going to keep changing, improving on its own terms, becoming more meaningful or maintaining its meaning. And in Florida, the ways in which they dance have to have meaning to the people who are dancing. Otherwise, they go defunct. And the same thing you can say in the Seminole Nation. I'll give you one really quick example. I hope I don't have this backwards. In Florida, they dance around the fire at green corn ceremony in the direction that the earth goes around the sun. In Indian Territory, they went the other direction. When a Seminole man from Florida went out there, he was aghast that they were doing it backwards, unaware that the Seminole Nation consciously decided to go the other direction as a means of marking removal. All right. Would Seminoles be a mix of all Aboriginal Florida people? Well, all Native nations have a mixture of ancestors. There is no such thing as a pure fill-in-the-blank Native group. If you go back far enough, much the same way that there's no pure anything. We're all mixtures. So the Indians in Florida are mixed of many different, what we would call nationalities or tribes or chiefdoms. Many from Florida, but also Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, like what we would call Greater Florida or the Greater South for the most part. Next question from, let's see, what are your personal feelings towards FSU pregame football tradition involving Osceola and Renegade? All right, you laugh. We'll have to do a talk another time about that. It is complicated. Here's the most important thing for me to know. My own, I went to University of Florida. I got my MA and PhD there. So I have no vested interest in the halftime show. When UF plays FSU, don't boo me. I'm a Gator. They paid for me to go to school. At some point, I'll maybe have to rethink this because I hate the way UF is dealing with the pandemic. But the Seminole tribe of Florida sanctions it. And for me, I care deeply about the ability of Seminoles to make decisions for themselves. and my own feelings of what is good or right or what could be done better or what's worse is less important than my satisfaction that the tribe is consulted and through very official channels that the chairman and the council and the board of the Seminole tribe has said it's okay. If tomorrow they say it's not okay, I'm going to nod along with it. I care more about the political power of Native people than their representation. Right. So the Seminoles would say that Osceola is dressed the same way that George Catlin made his portrait, but obviously his riding on a horse and carrying a flame, that's obviously not a real rendition. But that's for the Seminoles to decide, not for me. Will genetic work help answer origins? No. Genetic work amongst Native people is remarkably misleading. We have no baseline to define tribe. Tribe is nation, not geography. We don't have Calusa DNA. We don't have Takesa DNA. We don't have Appalachee DNA. So there's no baseline to compare it to. The way in which on the genetic side, the 23andMe of the world do things, they start with correlations and they turn them into causations. And so they can get pick a number, 100,000 people who say that they think that they're English in their background. And then they will look for, originally they looked for common ground on the mitochondrial DNA. And then they said, okay, all these people say that they're English, and we can look at a certain percentage of that DNA is here. We're going to call that part of the DNA of the genome. We're going to call that English. They can't do that in indigenous worlds. So whenever people do 23andMe, they're mostly connecting themselves to Latin American indigenous people that 23andMe has lumped all together. I probably mangled that really badly, but to be Seminole and to be Creek or to be Cherokee, three modern Indian nations that have roots into the ancient South, on the genetic side, they might all look really similar to one another. But historically, they don't look similar at all, much the same way that you can take sections of Boston and do DNA on them, and they will look remarkably similar to the DNA, say, of parts of Ireland or parts of England. But we know they're not the same nation. They share kind of a past. Zocha has a question. Can you think of a single story person article that shaped your passion for the Seminole tribe? I have a bunch. So I'll do a shout out to Willie Johns. So Willie Johns, who just passed away recently, which is why I'll do a shout out to him. The last couple months he passed away. My sense of time is all off. But Willie was a historian, Seminole tribal member, went to college, studied ancient Greece, and then came home to the tribe and tried to learn as much about the history of the tribe as he could. He worked for the tribe. At the end of his life, he was chief justice of the tribe, but he did as much as he could to kind of capture and tell and record the history of the tribe that he could. And so he's the person that I think of who kind of gave me that spark. But I would say this about him. This is where, for me, the remarkable part of his story, like I can't think of many more people who are more talented than he was. He was a pretty successful cattleman. He was really smart when it came to law. He was committed to his community, like every possible way of describing it. But I was on a bus with him giving a tour of teachers one day, and he told me the story of being a child living basically a rancher without shoes. And I can't wrap my brain around it. And so the Seminoles have become very successful when it comes to gaming and other kind of commercial enterprises. And he never lost his passion for understanding his community or giving back to his community. He remained a cattleman to the very end. He was remarkably proud of the herd that was his. And his commitment to his community was something that I don't have that commitment to mine. And it made me realize that there was something really, I don't know if it's peculiarly unique to the Seminole tribe, but it got me really interested in wanting to know more. What is that kind of magnetism that brings people who have every option on their earth to do what they want to do to come and live in the center of the state and on the Brighton Reservation and call that home forever? Great question. Did I get all the questions?
Andrew, I do have one question of my own. It seems that we have been taught, or I have gleaned, that there was a significant Creek immigration to Florida at the end of the War of 1812 in particular. Is that true? I mean,
well, it is true. 4,000, we think, right? But nations have immigration policies or immigration histories, however you want to describe it. The question is, do Creeks come into Florida and create something, which is what the literature seems to imply, or do Creeks come into Florida, meet up with people who are here and join them? Now, the Brighton community, the Brighton community, which used to call themselves Cow Creeks, on the kind of the northern part of Lake Okeechobee, they speak the Muskogee Creek language, and most of them say that their ancestors, or some of their ancestors, were Red Sticks that came during the Creek War. But they also tell stories, like Willie Johns would tell the story, and Alex Johns, another member of the extended family. They say they got their last names from the St. Johns River because they've been running cattle up and down the river forever, which is a different origin story than the Red Stick story. So I think it's both. I think the Red Sticks come into Florida and they meet up with Creek speakers who are already here running Spanish cows, right? Spain evacuates Florida, they leave these large cattle herds in Alachua. Cowkeeper comes in and then a whole bunch of folks after him, and they make those herds Seminole herds, and they're running them up and down the St. Johns River, and the floodwaters, the headwaters, if you will, I'm sorry, are basically right where Brighton is. So I think the Red Sticks come in, and there are lots of them. Osceola is one of them, but they're joining with people who are already here, which doesn't make them the starters. They just become kind of this boost of energy and population.
Yeah.
But the United States, when they write about it, man, we need to invade the Seminoles because look, all of our old enemies, all these Red Sticks are there. We got to do something about that. And that's the first Seminole War.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Are there any other questions? Well,
yes, there is one. Now
sure.
There's two more questions.
Oh, good. Okay.
All right. So the question is whether Tequesta became Costa and then Seminole. So on this particular community in Miami, there's a village. We don't know the name of the village. The Spanish called it Tequesta because there was a chief named Tequesta. That village is there for a long time. And leadership is consistent for a long time. By somewhere around like 1680 to 1700, a whole bunch of refugees from elsewhere in most likely Florida, we don't actually know where, they are described as living in that Tequesta village. The Spanish no longer considers them to be Tequesta anymore, and instead call them Costa, coastal Indians, right? Nothing profound about it. It doesn't mean that who they are changed. More newcomers keep coming into that village, and at some point that village becomes labeled Seminole. in that village, know there are some Creek migrants. We know there are some migrants from the interior of what is now the state, from the peninsula. I think we can probably do the same thing, although we haven't done it already, for communities on the West Coast, which are Calusa. We can do that for certainly the folks in the interior, exactly where Nairn went. That's Fort Center, which becomes basically the Big Cypress Reservation. And I think we can see people having villages, and as migrants and refugees from elsewhere come in, they become part of this new community. The part of the talk that I didn't do that probably would help is that the Seminoles, or what we call the Seminoles, aren't a coherent, centralized people until the 1950s. And in the 1950s, the Seminoles, who speak two mutually unintelligible languages, their reservations or homelands are 80 to 120 miles apart from one another in some instances. They're told they're going to lose their reservations unless they do something, and they appeal and they go to Congress and they fight. And they get federal recognition in exchange for having you need to create a centralized democratic nation. And so they do, and some people are really mad about that. And the one group of Miccosukes refused to participate, and in a long story, they get separate recognition about a decade later. But that's when the Seminoles have to become Seminole, right? They sold themselves as Seminole for tourism, but the people to the best of my knowledge, the folks at Big Cypress and Brighton, the two reservations that were closest to one another, one speaks Miccosukee, one speaks Muskogee Creek. They didn't marry one another. They didn't talk to one another. They had bad words to describe children that would be of both. There are remarkably few that speak both languages historically, let alone in the present. But in the end, they become Seminole, right? So the story of them becoming Seminole is really, really modern. I grew up in northeast rural area of Leon County. My elders shared with us stories of Indians in our Black community. My father's grandmother was Cherokee named Suwannee. In oral histories from our elders, most of their ancestors were of Indian heritage. That does not surprise me at all. Love to one day actually talk to you in real life and hear these stories. But the number of, for lack of a better word, on the indigenous side, refugees who are looking for homes. If you're Appalachee or fill in the blank indigenous folk looking for a place to survive, there are these communities of former enslaved folks who can welcome you in. And I have no doubt that happens. And I know there are the stories doesn't give it the right word, the evidence for blending of communities of African origin and indigenous origin in Florida and the American South as a whole is really, really powerful. And we don't have, like we can see this for the Lumbee in North Carolina, we don't have a way of adequately measuring or defining what those communities are. The Lumbee have been trying to get in, recognition as a federally recognized tribe. They thought they were about to get it, and in the last moment it didn't pass, I think, the Senate. I can't remember how it worked. But they've been trying for a long time, but they're, according to too many folks, they're too mixed with too many different peoples, and so that doesn't quite work, as the United States expects more purity than actually exists. What was the relationship of local Native Americans in Tallahassee with the settlers here in the early to late 1800s? So Tallahassee gets formed in the aftermath of the First Seminole War. There was a Miccosukee village basically here, or right near here, and there were other Creek and Seminole, or whatever word you want to use to describe them, indigenous villages throughout the Panhandle. And after that War of 1812, when there was a Creek Civil War, a whole bunch of Creeks come into Florida to get away from their Creek enemies, the Civil War, and it's remarkably bloody. And the Civil War put Great Britain on one side and the United States on the other, and it aligned itself with the War of 1812. And Andrew Jackson and his Creek allies, or Creeks with Andrew Jackson as the ally, came through the Panhandle of Florida and razed as much as they could. They burned villages. and it was brutal. And so by the time Tallahassee got founded, most of this area had been evacuated of its indigenous population. So there were some native people near here. Tallahassee means old fields. But for the most part, the native people who called Tallahassee home or homelands or hunting grounds, they had either been slaughtered or they moved deeper into the Florida Peninsula. Right, so often when you read about Florida history and you read Seminoles in it, the geography changes, where we talk about the first Seminole War being the Panhandle, the second Seminole War being Greater Gainesville, and the third Seminole War being like Greater Miami and up to Lake Okeechobee. When the first Seminole War occurs, all of Florida is Seminole or indigenous country. By the time of the second Seminole War, the Panhandle, the indigenous population had been pushed out, making way for enslavers and cotton. And by the time of the third Seminole War, Gainesville or Hoggstown, that too had been depopulated, right? So it feels like Seminoles are being pushed onto new lands rather than they're just they're having their lands constricted. So indeed, lots of Seminoles were removed and stayed in Florida because they were Tallahassees, and they lived in the area of Tallahassee, and then they got pushed down further south, and then further south. There you go. But by the late 19th century, there's no real indigenous population here. They could travel here, but they really didn't.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's been worth the wait. Andrew was supposed to be our March speaker last year. And of course, the pandemic swept over everything. So we've been, we're awfully glad that he was here. This was a very good lecture. If Brendan will activate my video, I will show you your official Tallahassee Historical Society travel mug.
Awesome.
And there it is, which is our honoraria for our speakers. And I will get this to you. We will email back and forth, and I will get this to you. And thank you. Thank you very much. We're glad to have you on the Bicentennial Committee. We're glad to have you speak tonight. Before we adjourn, I will give a little preview of our February meeting. You all may know, sort of rippling beneath the surface of the news through Tallahassee this year have been, have been reaction to and efforts to create a state holiday for Emancipation Day. The only problem is that the state holiday that the legislators want to name as Emancipation Day is June the 19th, I think, which is not Emancipation Day for Florida, it's Emancipation Day for Texas. And so there's been kind of a struggle all year led by our good friend, Althemise Barnes, retired from the Riley House, and City Commissioner Diane Williams Cox, to make the legislature realize that emancipation in Florida actually came a month earlier, in time, May the 20th, for example, and that this has become a pretty significant celebration in Florida. And so I say this has not burst out onto the news that much, but it's been there. There's a struggle going on. And so in February, we're going to have a little panel discussion. Althemise is going to join us. Representative Cox is going to join us. We have offered an invitation to Senator Bracey, who is the sponsor of the Senate bill, which would make Juneteenth an official state holiday. And I haven't heard back from him. I'm not particularly optimistic, but we are still trying. But Emancipation Day is a pretty significant holiday and a pretty significant celebration in Tallahassee. And it's something that we ought to talk about. And so we will at our February meeting. So stay tuned. Thank you all very much. With that, we will adjourn for the evening, and we will see you in February.